Good morning, everyone. My name is Hans Felber Charbonneau. I'm Communications Coordinator at Democracy Reporting International, an NGO based in Berlin. We're happy for you to be joining us this morning for this conversation on press freedom and the rule of law in Europe. Before I hand it over to our panelists, I'd like for you to share your questions through the dedicated Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. And what we'll be doing is going through your questions and sharing them with the participants. The conversation we're having today is part of the Reconstitution program dedicated to promoting better public debate on the rule of law and democracy in Europe, and is funded by Stiftung Mercator. So the panelists who are joining us today have dedicated their professional careers to these challenges. I would like to let them introduce themselves and their work on the rule of law and press freedom, as they will do so much better than I can. I'm pleased to have joining me today Adam Bodnar, who's Poland's Commissioner for Human Rights, Julia Haas, Project Officer with the Office of the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media, Lisa Maria Kretschmer, who's an advocacy advisor with Reporters Without Borders Germany, and John Morijn, who is a professor of law and politics and international relations at the University of Groningen and a commissioner at the Netherlands Institute for Human Rights. So I will let them introduce themselves in alphabetical order, starting with you, Adam.
Hello, good to see you. Just a few words about myself. I serve as the Commissioner for Human Rights. The traditional name is Ombudsman of the Republic of Poland. I will serve until 15th of July this year. I served for more or less last 6 years. My term has ended in September last year, but because of the decision of the Constitutional Court, I have to finish, although the new ombudsman has not been yet elected to replace me. I'm also professor of law at SWPS University in Warsaw. And I deal with rule of law because I try to do everything what is possible in order to protect rule of law in my country. And we have also a lot of problems with media freedom. And I hope I'll be able to explain some of the details of my involvement into those cases. Thank you.
So good morning from Vienna. My name is Julia Haas. I'm with the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, where we work on media freedom across the entire organization, which is 57 participating states, kind of representing or spreading around the Northern Hemisphere, so to speak. It's a security organization, but it has acknowledged quite early on already that human rights are an integral part of security, and it does not only have this military, political side, but also economic, environment, and also human rights perspective. And that within the human rights frameworks, of course, media freedom has a particular role, which is why this institution was founded. And there I work, me personally, particularly on digital rights and the combination or the interaction of new technologies and freedom of expression, media freedom, and digital participation. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussions today and to also share a little bit more input of our work later on.
John, I think we'll hand it over to you, as we seem to have lost Lisa.
Okay, well, many thanks to the Democracy Reporting International for the invitation, of course. It's a pleasure to be here in this distinguished panel. As you mentioned, Hans, I'm currently a professor of law in Groningen and commissioner at the Dutch National Human Rights Institute. Before that, I worked for the Dutch government for 10 years, for the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of the Interior, working specifically on human rights files, including the EU rule of law and free speech. And I often represented the Netherlands in working groups in Brussels. And there I also saw the atmosphere changing between 2010 and 2018 when I was there. So that experience informs my views here today. So at the Netherlands Human Rights Institute, I hold the portfolio of international human rights infrastructure and EU rule of law protection. And I often get the question, why do you then bother with looking across the border? And the answer to that is pretty simple. We're all connected, and actually the EU and the Council of Europe system of human rights are an intrinsic part of what is important to the Netherlands. So if there's a problem across the border, it's also my problem. So my interest is selfish, so to say, in that regard. And as a Dutch National Human Rights Institute, we also participate in the umbrella organization for human rights institutions called the European Network for National Human Rights Institutions. I made a little bit more of a more extended introduction, if you'd allow me, Hans, because I wanted to show when it comes to what we're discussing today, and maybe Christophe can pull up a slide, one of my most formative moments in thinking about what we're discussing today, the rule of law and the freedom of the press. It was a moment that I sort of lost my naivete. It was in a courtroom in November 2019. I sat behind Professor Wojciech Sadurski in a small and packed courtroom. I looked at his back. Well, this is someone I used to look in the face because he was, in fact, my professor of the rule of law at grad school at the European University Institute. To his left, you can see that in the lower picture, to the right of the man in black, you saw the two prosecutors who were acting on behalf of the de facto Polish leader, Jarosław Kaczynski, who had claimed that a strongly worded tweet by Wojciech Sadurski had slandered him for a different tweet. He had also been sued by the captured TV station and TVP. And both of these cases that were brought against Sadurski are typical SLAP cases, strategic litigation against public participation. And the aim of bringing these cases is not so much to win these cases, but they're all about suing to scare and silence your opponents. To the left, all the way on the lower picture, you see the independent press. They were sitting right next to me in this packed courtroom, scribbling their notes. But also, in fact, many of the press currently in Poland are being subject to SLAP cases. And in front of Sadurski, you see that on the top picture, you see a judge who eventually, I should note, ruled in his favor. But you could not but imagine the type of pressure she must have felt under, given the prosecutors to her right were clearly under political instruction and the capture of the courts in her hierarchy. So this, for me, is a capsule version of what we're talking about today. It shows in these two images how academic freedom, freedom of the press, the rule of law, in the sense that everyone is under the law and the law is applied equally to everyone for the purpose that it was written. And also independence of judges and prosecutors are all related. It also shows what happens in backsliding regimes and all these interconnections. I think that we'll be discussing about today, but this is why I'm working on this, just like Adam every day, and I'm very glad to be able to share some of my experience with you today. So thank you.
Thank you, John. And now we'll hand it over to Lisa, who is back with us.
Sorry for that. The internet connection seemed to be unstable. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Kretschmer. I work as an advocacy officer at Reporters Without Borders, and RSF, Reporters Sans Frontières, is an international human rights organization, just as a background, that defends press freedom worldwide. And that also includes, of course, like the defending journalists from physical attacks, but also more subtle attacks. And that's where it really leads to rule of law, because then also the media system as such is under threat if it's not independent any longer, if there laws used against the media system, then it's then we can't really have a free press. And that's as an advocacy advisor, I advise our organization which avenues to take to prevent this and to counter those developments. And there are different avenues for this: diplomatic avenues, political avenues, legal avenues, and we try to go all of them at the right time. And for us, rule of law and press freedom, freedom of information is really so intertwined and at the core of our work, really, because yeah, as John said, if all entities should be accountable to the laws, but if there's nobody watching, if they really are, so then it's really a problem. And yeah, so, and at the other hand, governments need to protect independence and pluralism of media, otherwise they can't really fill this role. And so it's really at the core of RSF's work, and I'm happy to share more details with you today.
Thank you, everyone. We've already heard mention of some of the challenges that we're facing, either from erosion from governments. John brought up the example of SLAPP lawsuits, new technology business models. So I would start by asking you to tell us a bit more about these wider systemic challenges and threats that you can see to the rule of law and press freedom, so that we can see which ones are in common between the two. Julia, if you would like to start.
Yes, of course. So maybe before going into the challenges, because I just briefly introduced myself before, but maybe also to add, I mean, the approach that we at the OSCE, of course, have, even though we have this media freedom mandate, is also, I mean, I think it's clear to the audience that is joining today why independent journalism and also access to information is really kind of like the bedrock of society and democratic societies. But also something I wanted to refer to in the introduction is that the media very often is referred to as the fourth estate, right? And I think it's really already the word fourth already indicates or presumes that there are these three other pillars. And I think that that's really kind of at the core of what we speak about today, because independent media is an important guarantee against abuse of power, but of course it only works in a system of checks and balances. So yeah, I just wanted to say that I think that's really at the core of what we speak about today, that of course we need media freedom and we need factual scrutiny, we need information, reliable information, trust, but we also need the rule of law and equality and the other things. So I think it's really important also when we look at the challenges that we don't look at them in silo, because they're really interlinked. And we have seen, and I'm sure that also colleagues who have more the lens of the media freedom cite that threats against the media really thrive in a system where the rule of law is lacking or weak, and that also the backsliding of the rule of law really undermines independent media and also threatens the safety of journalists, for example. But as you already mentioned, like a broader challenge maybe that we see, I wouldn't then maybe not go into the more obvious maybe examples that we already have heard, like SLAPPs, or also the system of impunity, but refer to another challenge that might, as I said, not be as obvious, but that we work on a lot and that I think is really, really important, which is the technological side. So let me maybe give you a little bit of views why I think when we speak about media freedom, when we speak about the rule of law, we really have to look at the digital environment as well. I'm sure that you're all well aware that we had this shift over the last decades when we look at, for example, media consumption or information consumption, and that really millions migrated from legacy media to digital channels and to the internet. And that came along with, for example, or just to give two examples, additional financial struggles to the media and to independent media, and also to a decline of trust. And here I think it's really important that we acknowledge that internet intermediaries and social media platforms in particular have become the primary curators and disseminators of information, and not only of general information and user-generated information, but also of news and media content. And this takes place very often without any regard to fact-checking or journalistic principles or editorial responsibilities. Or to the contrary, even the algorithms and the systems that stand behind are designed in a way to maximize profit, so to maximize traffic and user engagement. And that might even drive the dissemination of deceptive or polarizing or hateful content. And all of this takes place outside the traditional rule of law system and outside or with a lack of accountability structures. So I think maybe just at the outset, of course, happy to discuss further and to also provide more input. But I just want to say that when we speak about these two broad issues, I think it's really important to look at the socio-technical context and who is gatekeeper to information, who has these powers, and for what reasons, and kind of like for whom are the dissemination algorithms optimized for, and that sometimes like these content disseminations really prioritize things that are kind of like at odds with accuracy and factual information or credibility, let alone plurality or public interest or democracy. So of course, there's still much more to discuss in this context, also when we speak about responses from the regulatory side and threats that come with that. But yeah, I just wanted to throw out already now this technological side and the concentration of power, which I truly believe is one of the big challenges of the information landscape and media landscape that we have these days.
Thank you, Julia. I think concentration of power is also one of the themes that will emerge throughout this conversation. Adam, could you share with us some of your experiences?
I think we are right now in Poland at this moment when we start to realize why this interconnection between rule of law and media freedom is important. Because please note that some of those changes that have been made in Poland were achieved as a result of so-called salami tactic, by cutting independence of different institutions and by dismantling different mechanisms of the rule of law. And more or less everything started between 2015 and 16 with the capture of the Constitutional Court. In fact, Wojciech Sadurski, that has been presented by John Morijn, is the author of the most important book on the Polish constitutional breakdown, the book published by the Oxford University Press. So I will not go to detail concerning this process. Everything is basically there in this book by Sadurski. But this capture of the Constitutional Court allowed to pass all different kinds of legislation and create a machinery of restricting freedom. I mean here the change in the amalgamation of the office of the Prosecutor General of the Minister of Justice. So in Poland, the executive member of the executive body is at the same time Prosecutor General, with a huge influence on every investigation in the country. It was also subordination of the civil service, and also subordination, and this is, I think, interesting from my point of view, of public media. Public media that were serving important public mission, and with a significant coverage, especially in rural areas and in smaller cities, especially information TV that is in the operation of the public television. In 2017, the attack on Polish judiciary started. This attack is far from being over, and I think Polish judiciary is having a lot of scars. Some institutions within the judiciary have been captured, and they are not any longer independent. But I don't want to go into detail regarding this, but I would like rather to say about a few processes, because all of this serves the process of creating a system of competitive authoritarianism, which is a system where you are controlling all different state institutions in order to have a competitive edge over opponents. So the incumbent is controlling basically the situation by removing different means of accountability and by using different practices to target opponents, including the use of the public media. And that is the process that we observe, like this mixture of lack of accountability with the different methods of propaganda and abuse of public resources for purely political and one-party purposes. And certainly it affects media heavily. So I said already that public media are serving only interests of the ruling party. But interestingly, and here I would like to underline it, is that some other media are also victims of this process. So even if some of them appear to be private or independent, in fact they are not, because they are subject of a strong commercialization practices by the state. Like, for example, advertisements ordered or commissioned by the state-owned company. So if you go into that kind of a sponsorship relationship, then you are not any longer independent. Second, the state has recently bought a network of regional and local newspapers that were previously in the operation of the Polska Press, the German company. And this media entity has been purchased by the Polish giant oil company. So one of the Polish state-owned companies, a little bit like similar to South Korean, chaebols, that is like owning all different parts of industries. So here this company has entered into the media market, and it is quite obvious to everybody that the end result of this process is subordination of media. Moreover, so it means that even if some private media remain, they have much difficult position to operate on the market, and this space for freedom and the space for pluralistic discussion is being narrowed almost every month. Another technique which is implemented and used by authorities is slap litigation. So I would say that we can observe like two types of slaps. One is against media titles like Polish respected daily Gazeta Wyborcza or some internet portals. And here, those slap lawsuits goes intense. I think altogether we can calculate more than 100 slap lawsuits in Poland brought against all different entities. But please note also that some individual players are targeted with slap. So Wojciech Sadurski is one example, but we have a couple of LGBT activists, women's rights activists, historians, environmental activists, basically people who are active in the public field, that this slap litigation, but also use of some notifications to the prosecutor's office, use of this whole state apparatus is one of the ways to chill the dissent and to chill the public discourse. So, and here we see why courts are important, because in order to protect all those people, you need to have independent courts, because otherwise, if courts are loyal to the government, then basically you cannot count on resolving your problems, your cases with the slap litigation, with resolving your problems caused by the slap litigation. The submission of slap lawsuit is already a big trauma for a person who is subject to it. But but still, it seems to me that there is like a relative security that Polish courts will behave properly. At least as far as I observe Polish jurisprudence, I see it. But the question is how long? How long they can be strong enough to survive this pressure? And second point, it is not just slap litigation and slap response, but I think that the response should be much more comprehensive, because you cannot, even with the best anti-slap legislation, even with the best courts, you cannot resolve problems of media ownership or the use of media for political purposes. And together with John, we have published an article for Politico arguing that in the context of the European Parliament elections and the sphere of competence of the European Union to regulate all different things concerning the European Parliament elections, it is the task for the European Union to take it seriously what happens in Poland, in Hungary. It seems also that in some other member states. And I hope that the Commission will look carefully into our argument and will not just end up with some technical legislation on slap. And in the meantime, the freedom of speech will be finally destroyed in Poland. My second point is that we need also a very comprehensive response by international organizations. And for example, next year, Poland will take the chairmanship in OSCE. And it seems to me that it is the moment for the OSCE to say to Poland, okay, what is the requirement of being the chairholder of OSCE in terms of freedom of speech? Just as a final point, which is a little bit connected with my service, one of the last actions I did was the submission to the court of the case concerning this purchase by PKN Orlen, oil giant of the Polska Press company. As a result of my appeal, the regional court in Warsaw has suspended the transaction. And here, once again, we come to the what is really the value of the rule of law in that kind of countries. Because, you know, despite the suspension, this operation is being continued. So PKN Orlen is basically ignoring the court order. And why is it possible? Because Mr. Kaczyński, leader of the ruling party, stated as follows: we think that the decision of the court is wrong, and it was based on wrong interpretation of law, and we think it is not binding. So if Mr. Kaczyński publicly is sending that kind of a signal, it means that whatever happens and whatever material decision is taken, nobody will face any responsibility for this. So the rule of law ends up when the leader of the party, with his statement, is replacing court verdicts. And that is something which is extremely painful, because you are losing your arguments. You are losing your methods to action. You know, people ask me, okay, so what are you going to do, Mr. Ombudsman, now with this? And I say, I cannot do anything with it because I did what I should. I've made a case to the court, but what can I do when court decisions are just openly ignored by authorities, and there is no significant reaction to this? And only you can hear, you know, some voices of concern of some journalistic associations or maybe some international organizations, but that's it. So this strategy of cutting slices of salami step by step is implemented in Poland. And after a couple of years, you see that the general picture is much more different than it was before. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Good highlight on how many of these systemic challenges are being brought together in one country with the situation in Poland. Lisa, working with Reporters Without Borders, looking at the situation from Berlin, of course, being Murphy's Law, it appears that Lisa's internet connection disappeared as I mentioned her. So I'm going to redirect my question to John and say, you've been working quite a bit on these questions. I'd be interested to hearing your point of view from a bit further afar, looking at the overall systemic risks.
I think that Julia and Adam together already gave an extremely comprehensive overview. I'm not going to repeat that. Evidently, I agree with the thing that Adam mentioned, because I co-wrote it with him. So but maybe zooming out and adding one or two elements. I think there's just part of the reason why we have increasing volatility and vulnerability of the press are wider trends that the traditional press simply in the digital age has less of a monopoly or less of a filter function of informing the public debate. So it's also less intuitive than it used to be for many citizens to accept what comes out of the press or what is being presented in the press as authoritative. And I think that what we've all seen in the COVID era is telling in that respect. Recently, just last week, there was an extremely worrying report in the Netherlands, because this is definitely not something that is only happening in Poland or Hungary at all. It was a very worrying press report in the Netherlands about that there was a questionnaire sent to journalists, and over 80% of all journalists in the Netherlands had been threatened or in any way for the reporting in the last 2 years alone. imagine. So when you're out there and with this low threshold access through social media, Twitter, and all that, you're also much more vulnerable to being harassed. So the second, what is an important element is that too is that there's no longer a citizen's instinct that having access to reliable news is something that you have to pay for or invest in. You know, it's we all know this intuitive annoyance with hitting a paywall and then you just go through all these free websites. So these things combined make, in my view, that the media is under pressure as a business model more generally, and that creates a general context that Adam and Julia already described so well, that you play into this playbook of authoritarians that want to simply capture everything that is independent and should be independent, including the fourth estate that Julia was mentioning. One important aspect that hasn't been mentioned yet by Adam, but I think is important, he said that, for example, in Poland, some public media are now basically used as a mouthpiece for very specific views. That also has an important European law aspect, because basically, if you interfere with the market, in this case, the media market, in a way that you only heavily invest in one part of it and not in another, you also get into the area of state aid. And this is something that was actually brought up, for example, in the Hungarian context. Many letters were sent to the Commissioner for Competition Policy, and nothing was done with that. It's this overall context, this connection between the rule of law and press freedom is not yet on the radar in other directorate generals than the one that Adam and me are addressing our letters to, but it's a much more general problem. It's also an internal market problem. It's a competition problem, and it should also be addressed in these regards. So my viewpoint, Hans, is really that there's this general context of the media landscape changing more generally, it being less seen as normal, that you simply should leave a journalist alone, and that is a conducive environment to some of the backsliding problems that were well described.
Thank you, John. Yes, Julia.
Maybe if I can just briefly add something to the excellent points that John made while we are still waiting for Lisa's return. I think something really closely interlinked to what you just mentioned is really this issue of trust. Because it's not only the question of how much value society still puts on reliable and fact-checked and research content, but it's really something that also we have observed in the OSCE, this really increasing distrust towards journalists and the media, which is also very closely linked, of course, then with attacks against individual journalists, as you also mentioned, like vulnerabilities, and maybe we can then also later when we speak more on the individual challenges or challenges for individual journalists, also go more into detail here. But I think it has also really this digital angle that now that there is so much information out there without this editorial control, and we have fought so many years and worked so many years for all these rules and this framework for legacy media, for professional journalistic standards and all these things, and really this framework also for self-regulations, etc. And now we are in a situation where many people cannot make this distinction anymore. So I just wanted to throw that out, and I think maybe we can discuss it later, but I think this issue of trust is really, really highly important because it links to all of that. And then of course we can also discuss, for example, the topic of disinformation and how it also really increased over the course of last year. And I think that these issues are really all so closely interlinked that it's just important to mention the different aspects as well.
Thank you, Julia. Adam.
I would like to come briefly to what John said about these competition rules. because I think it was not very much clear from my presentation. Please note that I have challenged this purchase by PKN Orlen, oil giant, of Polska Press. I challenged not the transaction as such, but the decision of the competition authority to agree on this transaction. So I thought and I claimed that you cannot treat this transaction as just a business, one of the business models, but PKN Orlen, being the state-owned company, is basically acting here as a little bit like a proxy of the general state apparatus. And it is the role of the competition authority to look into this and to look at it from the point of view of protection of some not general standards concerning freedom of speech. So to what extent that kind of a transaction affects like the more general constitutional landscape of a state. And I know that this case is a very interesting one, not only to, let's say, human rights lawyers or freedom of speech lawyers, but also to the people from that are dealing on a daily basis with competition law. Because they didn't have that many examples of the intersection between the general competition regulation and constitutional regulation. They didn't have a lot of discussions concerning the involvement of so-called public interest in those decisions on concentration. And moreover, the whole thing is presenting another question of the independence of the competition authority. So by virtue of the EU law, competition authorities should be as much independent as possible. But to be honest, European Commission has accepted this trend towards restricting independence of the competition authorities. So for example, right now, the head of the competition authority is to a great extent subordinated in my country to the prime minister. So he's not responsible for just like the general evaluation of the situation from the point of view of competition rules, but he has to take into account, just naturally, because he's not so independent as he could be, political interests of his government. So, so here, what we need is not just a discussion on some specific cases, but whether the EU instrumentarium is adjusted to that kind of new phenomena. So the state aid is another example. So we need to look more for intersectionality of the operation of different elements of the EU law, because it seems to me that otherwise we will not be able to stop that kind of developments. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent additional point. Julia had brought up the kind of more structural issue of disinformation as well. I think this broader point in our conversation would be a good point if you want to address it a bit more with the rest of the panel, Julia.
Yes, of course. I mean, again, I think we could make back this link to really seeing the context in which information is really accessed these days and also curated. And I think here it's important, maybe as an outset, and then we can go into the phenomena a little bit more. But if we look at the internet and how it's structured and social media, and then we know that there are a few very powerful intermediaries or social media platforms that determine the rules of who sees what and what remains hidden and which perspective remains hidden. And while this is an issue for media pluralism more broadly, I think we also have to look at how they're designed. And here, even though they're very opaque, with opaque, I mean that it's really not transparent. We don't know, these companies don't share the information. But we know by now that in order to maximize profit, they might disseminate or prioritize content that increases the traffic onto their site and that increases user engagement. And it has also been proven by now that the content that drives more engagement by users is really the one that is sensational, that is emotional, that is polarizing, potentially also deceptive or hateful. So there are so many aspects to it again. But there has been, for example, when we now speak about disinformation, there has been a study by the MIT already a couple of years back that kind of proved that disinformation is really spreading 6 times faster than facts on social media platforms. I think they only looked at Facebook. And here, I think we really have to take into account this environment when we speak about disinformation. And then the second aspect, I think, is also the issue of trust, because of course, it has led to a situation where many people or many users already know that there is a lot of misleading information out there. And I don't want to say that propaganda or misleading information and the politicization or weaponization of misleading information is anything new. We know that that has been around since ever, or at least since the invention of politics. But it's really a new dimension because of this amplification that we see online. And this amplification that is even intentional to a certain degree by those who deploy it. And that really leads to this big issue of trust. Because if we don't have kind of this layer, this foundation of our democratic societies and also the trust in institutions and in the media, this really has a great impact on how we as society can function. So of course, there are many, many aspects to how to address it. And I think it's just really important to mention from the outset that, of course, like censorship cannot be the response, and that we have seen, especially now when we also refer to contexts such as Poland, that it's very easy, and we have seen also in the context of the COVID-19 crisis and emergency legislation, that many governments are prone to use legislation with the intention to address disinformation or problematic content online, that this can have an even worse impact on media freedom and on critical voices, of course. So I'm really not calling for regulatory responses, but I think it's really something that we need to address, that social media platforms need to address, where we also need some regulatory responses, but more on the process. So we need to look at the process of how information is disseminated, which information is amplified, and then we have to address these procedural things while not focusing on the content itself. And the second aspect, or the second side of this, of course, would be on the side of the users. And there we get into the discussion of literacy and how important it is really to make people aware, which does not mean that we would want people to just be skeptical about everything that they see online, because this is, of course, also not useful and can also be instrumentalized, as we have seen. But it's something where it's a complex challenge, which of course also requires comprehensive responses. But I think that these layers are important to discuss, to look at, and we really need to know more about these processes to be able to find responses. And just to add another layer is, of course, also the role here again of political and powerful actors who use misinformation or who spread misinformation very often in an attempt to avoid scrutiny and to also dismantle trust in media and into fact-checking. So here again, we see these interlinkages, because we have disinformation as a societal phenomena, and then we really have the political use or misuse of this phenomena and really boosting it or fueling it for their own political purposes. And there are different layers, just the same as when we speak about attacks against journalists. I think here also we see these two different layers of, so to speak, normal people, and then the political use, intentional use of such attacks. And they need different responses. But it's a very big challenge, and I think it's really interlinked to this overarching challenges of trust that we face this time, and this distrust in media or anti-media sense kind of emotions that we see now in society.
Thank you, Julia. I'd just like to let participants know that Lisa Kretschmer is having some technical problems. We're hoping that she'll join us again before the end of the panel, but we'll continue the conversation. John, earlier on, you had talked about some of the individual threats that journalists are facing in the Netherlands. Julia also just mentioned some. When I look at indexes around press freedom, a lot of the challenges seem to be targeted towards journalists. There's a lot of threats, a lot of personal attacks. We've had very high level cases, even at the heart of the EU. Whereas when we're talking about efforts to erode the rule of law, it's much more systemic. It's much more theoretical, if you will. I was wondering if you could talk to us a bit about how you move from whether or not you see similar trends when it comes to the rule of law, whether individuals are also being affected, also being threatened in the similar way you see with press freedom, or whether it is more this institutional level erosion.
Yeah, it's interesting that you draw that distinction. Part of the way that I have been contributing to the rule of law is actually to make the point that it's not something systemic, but there's real people making real decisions and being really courageous in concrete situations. I mean, we have a great example of that on our panel. If somebody else had been the ombudsman in Poland during this time, it would have been a lot less effective. So this is a real person. I've talked to many judges as well. Of course, there's a systemic trend, but the way that you can really draw attention to this is by pointing out this is Judge Pavel Jusicin. He did his duty by asking a preliminary question to the European Court of Justice simply because he was on an obligation to do so, and this is the effect on this specific person. And I've noticed that this is in fact making it easier for people to understand that this is not some sort of problem that is abstract and somewhere out there, but there's real people making real decisions of real consequence to them. That's why in my first slide, I drew attention to this judge. She is in a very hard, she was extremely courageous and followed the clear case law and decided in favor of Wojciech Sadurski. But if you're facing the prosecutor just a few meters away that is under clear political instruction, and you know that at least some of the highest courts that are above you in the hierarchy are captured, she will have to take into account all sorts of considerations that you would not normally have to as an independent and impartial judge. So if your point is that freedom of speech is concrete and rule of law is abstract, I do not take that. I'm just driving the point home simply to make it more concrete. What you see in individual cases, though, Hans, is that what you notice is that whether we like it or not, slap cases are effective. And that's the reason why they're used. Why? Because they change the calculus for somebody who is trying to do their job. If you have to spend a lot of time and a lot of resources on simply replying to cases that are not brought to win, but simply brought to annoy you, to put you in a spot, etc. This inevitably leads to a different calculation, perhaps, unless you're extremely courageous of how you go about doing your job. So the frustrating thing, and I completely agree with Adam there, is looking at slap cases in isolation. You can have a brilliant regime, with typically super detailed EU piece of legislation on how to do something about slap. But if the other persons in the courtroom that I showed in the first image their problems are not addressed simultaneously, you will have a beautiful Ferrari, but without a proper garage, let's say, to put it in. This would be my reply to that. So in fact, the point that you're making about freedom of press being concrete and the rule of law being abstract is precisely the sort of frame that I've sort of been trying to break a little bit. Rule of law is also concrete people doing concrete things and making concrete decisions in concrete situations.
Thank you, John. I would continue in the concrete impacts and the personification of a lot of these challenges by asking Adam if you want to take it from there in the specific challenges that can be faced when it comes to dealing with the erosion of the rule of law for individuals.
No, I think that the major challenge these days is when you are trying to defend values and you are either part of the state system, like when you are a judge or a prosecutor, or if you are an activist who is supporting values that are under pressure. And let me divide it this way, because what Polish judges are facing these days is a set of different kinds of disciplinary proceedings, but also proceedings aiming towards accusing them of some fake crimes in order to deprive them of immunity. And basically we had 3 cases like this. 3 judges have been deprived of immunity and suspended as judges. Fortunately, one of them, Beata Morawiec, has been recently reinstated. And most probably it was a result of the huge pressure on the disciplinary chamber in the Supreme Court, which is a little bit like a kangaroo court. And also most probably because of some bigger EU-Poland relations and adoption of the recovery plan. I think there were some other, let's say, political elements to silence a little bit the discussion on the rule of law because of some other political objectives. Another interesting category are prosecutors, because prosecutors, as I said, the whole structure is very much dependent on the political process. But can you imagine that we have still a group of more than 100 prosecutors that are extremely brave? They have established an association which is called Lex Super Omnia, law above everything. And they are just, speaking openly what they think about things. All of them have been already degraded to like lowest possible positions in the prosecutor's office. But interestingly, there is like a new strategy employed against them, which is sending them for compulsory delegation to the other unit of the prosecutor office. So, so just imagine that you are a prosecutor working on Thursday, on Friday or Friday in Warsaw, and you just receive on your desk a letter saying that, dear Mr. Prosecutor, dear Mrs. Prosecutor, on Monday you start to work in a city which is 400 kilometers far away from Warsaw. So, it's your problem how you will structure this and how you will rearrange your family obligations, how you will rent your flat or whatever. And basically we had a couple of prosecutors who have been treated this way. They try to fight back and they try to win their cases before courts, claiming that that kind of a practice is abusive practice and it violates labor law. So of course they approve some way of hierarchy and subordination in the prosecutor's office, but they claim that it shouldn't, that kind of practices should not happen just without taking into account their personal and family situation. So it is a pure example of targeting and a pure example of revenge on independent prosecutors. And please note that they are risking a lot, because for them it's not just a question of being loyal to principles, but it is also a question of whether they will stay in the legal profession. If they would imagine that they would like to resign from the prosecutor's office, possibly they can register as attorneys. But interestingly, Minister of Justice, Prosecutor General at the same time, can refuse to register them as lawyers. So that is a huge risk for them. They don't have like a easy possibility of way out, of finding some other life strategy for them. But I would like to say that there is a lot of sacrifice with people who are activists, scholars, different people involved into the process of fighting for rule of law, but also freedom of speech. And there is also one interesting notion which was coined by Professor Kurt Weiland. He published his article based on examples from Latin America in the Journal of Democracy, which was entitled Discriminatory Legalism. So please note, the strategy is sometimes not so much about abusing the law, but simply using law in a very formalistic way in order to target your opponents. So there is a famous statement by Oscar Benavides, the former president of Peru, saying, "For my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law." So that is what happens. You know, you have all those different kinds of slap litigation, but also other ways of targeting you, like, you know, there are some notifications to the prosecutor's office. You have to appear in different cases. You have to make testimonies. If you were organizer of the women's strike, a big demonstration against the painful verdict on abortion, leader of the women's strike is having a case for bringing the threat to the major to the big groups of population because of the COVID. So, you know, you try to find all different legal arguments just to pinpoint somebody, just to target somebody. And then I agree fully with John. Everything depends on the moral courage of those people, but also on bonds of solidarity. So whether they feel alone or whether they have a significant support. And here I must say that Polish lawyers, but not only lawyers, are playing a beautiful historical card. Can you imagine that, you know, all those judges who are targeted, they are having the best ever professional representation, you know, so you may find, you know, some criminal lawyers who are usually representing, you know, people in some white collar crimes for some, you know, hundreds of euros per hour. And now they represent pro bono all those judges. And it is a greatest honor for them to be with those judges when they are targeted, because they feel that it is not just about values, it is about survival of a democracy, and also, which is also a generational thing for me, it is about remaining by Poland in the European Union. So we know that it is a fight for the future of our, you know, one of the greatest civilizational successes of Poland. And, you know, my generation was part of this. And when we are engaged so much, it means that we are fighting for something bigger, not just values taken in a very general or abstract way, but we fight for the membership of Poland in the EU, because we know that this last 17 years is one of the greatest successes in the history of Poland for, you know, last, I don't know, 5-6 centuries. Thank you.
Thank you. John and Adam have done a magnificent job of really showing the people the reality behind the concepts and the values that are being fought. Yulia, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the challenges that journalists are saying are meeting, how their daily reality. John had talked about how 80% of journalists in the Netherlands, fairly, let's say, calm Western European state are facing. We can only imagine what it is in situations where the political climate is different or more polarized. So if you could tell us a bit that, and also I know that there's a different dynamic too when it comes to male and female journalists. So if you could address that as well in your answer. Yeah, thanks a lot for pointing that out. I mean, I think what we have heard now and all these attacks on individuals is unfortunately we see very much the same trends also when we speak about journalists and independent journalists, of course. So the safety of journalists is, of course, like one of the priorities when we speak about media freedom, because if they cannot report on the issues and, for example, also on the diminishing of the rule of law, or, for example, about slap cases, then the society is also not informed. So again, we see how it is kind of like all interlinked. To get into this point of attacks and harassments of journalists, I mean, this is something that we have seen since ever and again. We have this kind of like new dimension since in the online context, and since it's also so much easier kind of for both individuals but also for politicians to harass or target individual journalists online. And you're absolutely right to point out that there is this really gender and also intersectional dimension to it.
So maybe let me go a little bit more into detail of the safety of women journalists online, because I think here we see the same trends that Adam also just outlined, and the different layers maybe of threats to the greater system. Because if an individual journalist is attacked, or now for the example of women journalists, because there has been a recent study by UNESCO and the ICFJ that showed that 2/3 out of all women journalists have been attacked online. And it has also been proven that there is a clear link to offline attacks and to offline violence. So I think we really have to get rid of this thinking, which unfortunately is still prevalent with many, of online is not real, or it's kind of like a different system, because there is a clear link, and it has kind of like real life, even though I wouldn't want to sound like online is not real, but this is how it's often framed, that the online attacks really have an impact on the real life or like on offline system. So if an individual journalist is attacked, then of course this has an impact on her individual right to speak out, and it leads to self-censorship. And I think here we again see this link to what Adam and John have previously outlined, that of course the willingness to report or to report on certain issues is certainly affected. And one of the main challenges here, I think, is that we cannot measure it. Self-censorship is something that we cannot measure. It's just something, there are perspectives that are missing, there are voices missing, there are stories missing, and we don't even know. We don't get the full perspective of diverse societies, or like of our problems and challenges, but we are not even aware of it because it's just missing. So it affects the individual person, and of course also on the emotional side. So of course, like there is this whole issue about trauma, and then we also have the more systemic level, maybe again to link it back to the discussion that we had before, that if journalists are attacked, or if women journalists are additionally attacked and face this double burden, then of course this also has an impact on the gender equality more broadly, or on who is even willing and able to speak out in the public and to inform the public about their perspectives. And then of course it also affects the right of society to access pluralistic information. And so again, we have this kind of like different layers, which I think are very much in line with attacks against activists, attacks against critical voices, attacks against journalists. And here again, I would like to underline this difference of political leaders or politicians or those in power using these instruments to silence, for example, the press or also other critical voices. Because if we have this intentional use, this very much really is in an attempt to discredit scrutiny of what they're doing, and to really prevent the journalists from shedding light on these issues that are often intentionally kept in the dark, and it really prevails the media from doing their important role in society, which is holding those in power to account. And the second aspect I would also like to refer to when we speak about online attacks particularly, but of course also offline, which links more to the rule of law discussion, is how are such attacks dealt with by law enforcement and by the police. And here we still see that this first step of institutional support is lacking. And then of course, again, they won't be brought before the court, they won't be addressed. And this has an even greater impact than on self-censorship and on kind of like limiting the plurality of voices out there. So yeah, and then there are of course like a lot of other aspects that also fall in here, like for example, the role of media outlets and also like peer support. This is maybe something I can still add a sentence on, because also Adam mentioned this with regard to the prosecutors, which is something that we also see very strongly in the context of journalists, that if there is peer support and if there is, for example, like safety protocols in a media outlet, we are in a totally different situation than if, for example, a woman freelancer and maybe also a woman of color journalist and maybe also freelancer without the support of a media outlet is being attacked. So it's again really important to look at these intersecting factors of discrimination, but also of harassment, of attacks, and how to address it.
Thank you, Julia. As we approach the last 20-25 minutes of our conversation, I'd like us to start looking at solutions and how to react. Julia, you already talked about how solidarity, Adam touched on this as well, how solidarity can really help groups, how having media outlets stand behind their journalists can help. I was wondering if you could talk also a bit about the role of press councils. I believe that in some cases they've kind of under some pressure. How does self-regulation, can it be used to actually counter some of the erosions that we've seen? And if a press council has been, shall we say, eroded, then how can journalist associations counterbalance that or work against that? I'll redirect this back to Julia before letting Adam answer.
Yeah, sure. Maybe just very briefly. I mean, I think press councils are really an excellent, good practice examples of how self-regulation can really be effective if there is really independence. So I think it also links perfectly in this discussion we are having, that independent bodies and independent oversight, just as independent media, are both like they depend on each other and they're mutually reinforcing. So press councils can have very, very important role, especially when there is like an sectorial agreement on specific ethical professional standards that also the media can be held against. And I think here we have this element that press councils can have a positive impact on the standards. They can contribute to fighting disinformation, for example, as well. They can really contribute to building more trust in those media that are subject to the press councils. But again, we also see how it's interlinked to what I think Adam mentioned before, the financial system. Because just to give you an example of, again, a country that is not so much in the spotlight, just as John did previously with the Netherlands, I will now to refer to Austria as I'm based here in Vienna, where the press council is really excellent, but not all public media are part of the system. And here it's a long discussion about financial support. And this is something that has been addressed many, many times. And that in my opinion, would be a really strong tool to say that support also for the government support for the media, which of course is important, especially in this difficult financial situation of legacy media that we are facing. But it's, for example, not bound to the membership of a press council. So this could again be something where it's all very much interlinked, that it can be a very powerful and important tool, as long as it is independent and as long as it really is a factor for oversight and for scrutiny, and it can then also contribute to more trust and to fight the challenges that we have.
You know, in the Polish context, there was once an idea to create a press council, and this idea was even provided in the original press law from 80s, but in fact this organ is not existing and is not working. Instead, we have a constitutional organ which is called National Broadcasting Council, which is the constitutional organ having more or less the same rank as my office, of the Office of the Ombudsman. And it is the organ of the checks and balances with some tasks to supervise conditions for media pluralism and media freedom. But first, this organ concentrates more on licenses for broadcasting and is not so much interested and following the situation in other than audiovisual media segments. Second, this organ has been also subject of a political capture. So the current president of the National Broadcasting Council is at the same time one of the politicians of the ruling party. So you cannot expect any strong reaction when something wrongful happens. And moreover, you know, when we are talking about all different problems, regarding this. Those problems, they are already on paper by some international organizations like the OSCE ODIHR, Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights report on presidential elections in Poland. So this report stated that there was lack of sufficient reaction by the National Broadcasting Council when the public television was in fact advocating for the current president to become the president for the second term. And because of this, we can claim that elections taking place in 2020 were unfair because of the undue involvement of public television to support the incumbent, the acting president in his renomination. But I think that we should add to this that we have a couple of journalistic associations. But what is interesting is that you see that even within those journalistic associations, you have some divisions. So you have some associations that are very much loyal to the government, and you have some associations that are fighting for basic rule of law and freedom of speech standards. So simply, you do not have one voice. You do not have anybody with authority that could be able to speak with one voice. And this polarization is hugely devastating to conditions on freedom of speech. So even, right now I observe very interesting discussion because on the one hand, fighting for this, with this purchase of Orlen, by Orlen of Polska Press, I fight for freedom of speech because I think it is extremely important to guarantee those standards. But on the other hand, PK and Orlen has just announced that they are going to increase salaries of journalists working in Polska Press company because allegedly they were not properly remunerated for years. And immediately that kind of a position is having support of one of the journalistic associations and also trade unions working in this Polska Press. So that kind of a strategy of combining this economic element or using some weaknesses of the press market and also of the journalistic profession in order to achieve some bigger gains, some bigger political gains, that is something which is extremely visible. That is why also, that is also the reason why the state-owned companies are so openly entering the commercial market with advertisements, because it creates this patronage relationship, and then you have much bigger influence on a number of private media. And the result is that some media that appear to be private, they avoid touching on some topics. The way of argumentation is much more, let's say, is much more critical towards the opposition. You see that kind of, like different shades of gray here implemented. That it does not necessarily mean that you are becoming already heavily restricted in what you are talking, but you see this self-censorship practices. But what is also interesting is the way how authorities treat media, because they pick and choose with whom they would like to talk to. So, you cannot imagine the kind of a situation that you have a, let's say, like a press conference in the White House that all the media are present and basically all the media have a right to ask a question. Forget about it. These are authorities that are choosing those media they would like to appear or to comment on it, and some media are on the blacklist, and you cannot even dream about talking in real terms, asking real questions. Even the set of questions is subject of negotiations. Okay, so we can allow you to make an interview with the prime minister as long as some issues are not covered. So that kind of situation is also hugely destructive to the whole media landscape. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Yes, Julia.
At one point, I think it really leads back to this whole discussion about, again, like this power and power of information. Because I think this examples that you just gave really illustrate how there can be power over information and thereby really restricting independent media. And then maybe linking it back to the very beginning of what I said in the beginning of this discussion, also when we speak about social media platforms or private actors and their power of information. So I think really in the discussions we're having today, it's really about this undue power over information flows, over pluralistic and reliable information flows. And that's, I think, at the center of from both sides, from the rule of law as well as from media freedom.
Thank you, Julia. Yes, I think that one of the common themes that we're seeing here is that we're really back at the fundamental questions that have challenged us for centuries of the separation of powers, how to ensure that you have independent estates and that no one can take over and erode democracy in the way that we've seen. For participants, it appears that lightning has struck twice and John has lost his internet connection. So I'm really glad for Adam and Julia to still be with us to represent. We'll add Lisa and John the moment they can join us back. My next question would be, there's been quite a few initiatives out of the EU, the OSCE, the Council of Europe. I was wondering for you, what are the most effective tools that are being put forward that can actually really help strengthen the rule of law and press freedom? Adam, I would start with you.
You're right that there are a lot of initiatives. You know, I have a regular cooperation with OSCE High Representative on media freedom, and I think this this office is extremely important, and it could be even, you know, in this context I mentioned this upcoming OSCE chairmanship of Poland. I think that Council of Europe, especially with the Commissioner for Human Rights, but also with monitoring committee of the Council of Europe, is an important player in this regard. I think that we should underline the role of the European Court of Human Rights because, you know, without judgments of the ECHR shaping approach to media freedom, we wouldn't be able to put a pressure on courts how to adjudicate properly those cases. And whenever any Polish court is having a case involving freedom of speech, ECHR standards are basically used as more or less as a part of the domestic law. You know, I know that it should be like this, that it is the value of the European Convention on Human Rights, but it took some years, you know, to train Polish judges to behave like this, and now we see that this jurisprudence is useful. And also, it gives a chance for developing of the jurisprudence and to respond to situation. If I may suggest one thing, I would simply suggest more efficiency of the ECHR, because sometimes waiting, you know, a couple of years for a judgment makes things much more difficult to be in order to use those judgments domestically. So people sometimes do not even remember what was the case about when the court is deciding. But talking like more generally about this, it is still something important that we should appreciate, that we have this right to remedy, this right to complain to the ECHR, and that one day, you know, journalists may win their cases. Also, winning cases strengthens their local position, so makes them much more visible, and it could be important from the point of view of their professional diligence. I would argue that European Union should take more seriously media freedom, not only by seeking for this intersectionality with such rules like competition or state aid law, but also taking into account that you cannot have democratic result of European Parliament elections or local elections when media are subject of political subordination. So, you know, so how can you elect, let's say, MPs from Hungary when you are having just, you know, I think 1 or 2 weeklies that are still independent, a couple of radio stations that operate only internet because Club Radio has lost the license, and you have one significant internet portal, telex.hu, which is a success story because, you know, it got a lot of money via crowdfunding. But the previous portal, Index HU, was basically captured. So how can you organize in such a situation free and fair elections to the European Parliament? You cannot. So and simply that should be the task for the European Union, because European Union is always complaining, you know, we do not have competence here and there. We cannot do here and there something. But here they have clear competence. When the framers of the European integration decided to organize European Parliament elections nationally, they should guarantee for the proper landscape of organization of those elections. So here I see an important role. And final point, I see a lot of hope in the, and maybe it is also important from the point of view of OSCE. I mean, Transatlantic Alliance for Human Rights, Rule of Law, and Media Freedom. You know, the moment, you know, we come back to this moment when United States and Europe cooperates on the same values. It is a big thing, you know. Please note what happened 1-2 years ago. Right now, the level of discussion about values, about multilateralism, about strengthening of international organizations, about the value of democracy all around the world is like a, it's not just a fake discussion. It is discussion on with real politicians who are believing in this. And we should take advantage of this, and we should appreciate that we have this new moment in history.
Yeah, maybe to respond from the OSCE perspective. I mean, of course, and I wanted to mention it before, that Poland is chairing the OSCE next year. Of course, like we fully agree that this is the right time to also really scrutinize the adhering of the commitments by Poland, and for them kind of to also set the example, because that is also the role of the chairpersonship, and to set an example in respecting and implementing the commitments. And that's also why we currently also try to organize, if it's possible, hopefully also a country visit to Poland still this year. And then of course our office will also be in touch with you again. As you mentioned, we have a very good established and long collaboration and friendship. Also, I mean, maybe just to refer to the tools that the OSCE R4M has, I mean, again, we have these different layers of, for example, like public interventions, but also silent diplomacy. And here I think it's really important to also not underestimate, even though it's such a lengthy and often tedious process, to have this communication with states and to really point out specific situations and cases, which most recently, for example, also the license issue with Club Radio that you mentioned, Adam, is of course also something that's kind of like on our table, and that we also try to work on with the Polish government. Hello back to John. But of course, I don't think there's like a simple answer to your question of how to address the challenges, because we have seen, I think, through the discussions how multifaceted they are and how complicated. But I think it's, or maybe going back to what the OSCE R4M has in the toolbox kind of, is also to, for example, do legal reviews, which I find very useful always, because there we can make very, very specific recommendations how really to improve the language of legislation. And then, of course, like in specific cases to call for, I don't know, releases or also, again, receiving information of the stand. So this diplomatic mechanism, of course, is always a very lengthy and etc. But we have the structure where at the OSCE, all 57 states like sit on the same table every single week, and they discuss issues, and they also discuss these current issues of specific cases, but also of trends. And what we do is that we report every 6 months directly to the participating states, also on general trends. And many of the things that we have been discussing today, of course, are also reflected there. And then, of course, we try to provide assistance and really guidance to states. And there, For example, I mean, we have been briefly touching upon it in the context of social media or algorithms, AI. We have a project specifically focusing on this to provide really guidance on how states can safeguard freedom of expression in this new environment. Or when we speak about the safety of women journalists or female journalists online in particular, we really have very, very long worked on this, shed light to raise awareness, to really make also states and government representatives understand what is at stake here. And after like years of work and really putting on the agenda specific issues have led to also changes in commitments by the states. And I think the most prominent example here is that in 2018, the OSCE adopted for the first time by consensus a decision on the safety of journalists, where for the first time, the states also acknowledged that safety is a broad concept. So it's not only the absence of physical harm, but it also entails this economic and legal aspects, and also the online side. So of course it's small steps, but it's a continuous work by all these different actors to trying to push for more adherence to the commitments, to further develop the commitments. And then of course, an issue that we always have to work on and will always continue to need to work on is the implementation of the commitments that we already have, of the obligations. And maybe just to give a couple more examples, just today and tomorrow, actually, we have a judicial dialogue that takes place in Central Asia, where we put together judges from, for example, also the Netherlands, because John is now back, and others who work specifically on freedom of expression cases, to bring them together with judges from Central Asia who might not necessarily have this experience. Or for example, we organize also several, of course, events and bring together the voices, important voices, and work with journalists and so on. But being aware of the time, I might be stepping back now to also give John still the possibility to contribute.
Thank you, Julia. Yes, to participants, we might be going a few minutes over, just to give John the chance to have the last word, if you would. Adam and Julia just had some very concrete and actionable recommendations on international tools and how they can be used to strengthen the rule of law and press freedom. John, what I would ask you as kind of the closing word is, how can people working on press freedom and the rule of law, the communities around these, from officials to civil society activists to academics to national human rights institutions, how can they work to strengthen each other?
Thanks a lot, and apologies. There was a general electricity outage here, so I see a lot of blinking lights all around me. But maybe it was a Russian cyber attack to limit my freedom of speech. Who knows? my apologies for that. Of course, I don't know what brilliant observations Adam already made, but one that I want to point out that is possibly an important innovation is that the president of the European Court of Human Rights about a month ago gave a speech to the Committee of Ministers saying that he wants to reform the way that the European Court of Human Rights goes about prioritizing priority cases. And he actually mentioned rule of law and systemic cases. There's quite a lot of SLAP cases pending. So I would argue that this should fall within the ambit of the new policy, at least that's what I would argue for. For the EU, and I'm sure that Adam already mentioned, so my apologies for any overlap. There's of course a new proposal now by Jourova, the Commissioner for Values, to come up with a Media Freedom Act. Is that something you mentioned already, Adam? No, he didn't. I'm worried that this is just something to delay things, to do something without it being necessary. I view that state aid law, rules that we discussed earlier, but also this link that Adam and me pointed out in our political piece, that you cannot be an informed voter for EU level elections if you have no access to plurality of media. That has a direct impact on the fairness and the free and fairness of EU level elections. That could be an immediate tool to use infringement action. But perhaps the most important tool is one that is not used, but could be quite powerful. Is not only to think about legal tools, but also go into the public relations battle. What I find remarkable, really remarkable, is that I was the only one sitting together with my colleague from Groningen, Dimitri Korchinov, in this courtroom that I showed you the pictures of in the beginning. And there was no EU representative. You know, from my own country, we will have no qualms whatsoever to send representatives to court cases in Mozambique or wherever something is going wrong. But if it attacks our own system much more directly, somehow there's this diplomatic considerations, which I think is wrong. It would be extremely powerful if Jourova flew to Warsaw and only talked to Adam and NGOs and simply ignored the government altogether, because that would show an understanding that you're understanding the plot and you're understanding the way that all of the different things, freedom of the press and the rule of law, hang together. So my apologies once again for backing out on you and leaving you to your own devices, but I'm sure that the two others, brilliant panelists, took over. So thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you, John. With this, I would really like to thank Julia, Adam, and John for participating today, as well as Lisa Maria Kretschmer from Reporters Without Borders, who unfortunately had to leave due to technical issues. To everyone listening, to all the participants, we'll be sharing an evaluation form in the chat that we invite you to fill out and let us know what you liked and what we can improve. And with that, thank you once again to all of our panelists. This was a very fruitful conversations with clear ideas on how we can move forward. And I hope that our paths cross again. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.